fellow Americans.
You might be wondering, why in the world is there a 30-minute countdown before the show starts? Well, we actually start live every day at 4 p.m. Eastern time, so this whole 30-minute countdown is a chance for YouTube and Rumble to send out their alerts and notifications, so we encourage you to gather up and hang out with everyone in the chat room. So every day at 4 p.m. Eastern time is when we do this show live. You can join us for the countdown if you like, or just set your clock and reminder that at 4 p.m. Eastern is when we go live. You can also make sure you subscribe and turn on that bell notification, so hopefully you will get a notification.
What do you have to say about dictators of countries like Indonesia, who we sell weapons to, yet they are slaughtering people in East Timor? What do you have to say about Israel, who is slaughtering Palestinians, who impose martial law? What do you have to say about that? Those are our allies. Why do we sell weapons to these countries? Why do we support them? Why do we bomb Iraq when it commits similar problems?
There are various examples of things that are not right in this world, and the United States is trying. I really am surprised that people feel that it is necessary to defend the rights of Saddam Hussein, when what we ought to be thinking about is how to make sure that he does not use weapons of mass destruction.
I'd like to...
Who are shouting? Just a moment.
I'm not defending them in the least. What I am saying is that there needs to be consistent application of U.S. foreign policy. We cannot support people who are committing the same violations because they are political allies. That is not acceptable. We cannot violate UN resolutions when it is convenient to us. You're not answering my question, Madam Albright.
You briefed the press, did you not, when you were there?
Well, I had several jobs. One of my jobs was that of analyst. I also was an interrogator and indeed briefed the press when we, the CIA, wanted to circulate disinformation on a particular issue. Disinformation is not necessarily a lie. It may be a half-truth. And we would pick out a journalist. I would go do the briefing and hope that he would put the information in print.
What was your percentage of success?
We were pretty successful in planning information of a rather rarefied nature. For instance, if we wanted to get across to the American public that the North Vietnamese were building up their force structure in South Vietnam, I would go to a journalist and advise him that in the past 6 months, X number of North Vietnamese forces had come down the Ho Chi Minh Trail system through southern Laos. Now, there is no way a journalist can check that information. That's data derived from radio intercepts, spy in the sky photography. So either he goes with the information or he doesn't, and ordinarily or usually, the journalist would go with it because it looked like some kind of exclusive. Go after these gentlemen. I would be directed to cultivate them, to spend time with them at the Caravel Hotel or the Continental Hotel, to socialize with them, and slowly but surely to try to gain their confidence by dolloping out valid information which was true. And then I would drop into a conversation the data that we wanted to get across, which might not be true. One piece of data, for instance, that we managed to plant in the New Yorker magazine had to do with a supposed North Vietnamese effort in 1973 to develop airfields along the border of South Vietnam. The reason we wanted to plant this information was that we were trying to persuade the U.S. Congress that Saigon should continue to get a great deal of aid and that the North Vietnamese were the chief violators of the ceasefire accord. That was printed in the New Yorker magazine under the byline of Robert Chaplin, as indeed was a great deal of such information which we tried to circulate.
Frank, a two-part question. What were the objectives of or what was the objective of the CIA? What about the moral implications of what you were doing in feeding disinformation? Did the objective override the moral implications, moral problems?
Well, the objective of the agency in general is to generate intelligence and get it back to Washington, to get at the truth and make sure the policymakers understand it. When you plant disinformation, you are diverging from that objective, and I think probably in retrospect it was very counterproductive. I am, as an ex-CIA agent, opposed to the disinformation activities in which I was involved. I admit that I was involved, and I think it served no useful purpose. Propagandizing the American public or Congress is not the CIA's job. As to the morality of what the CIA was doing or that particular activity, the war was a very relative thing. It was a relativist environment, and morality seldom came into play when you were operating in the field. In my estimation, a CIA man should be amoral. That may sound pretty shocking to somebody, but what if my morality were that of a Nazi or agent, if you will? You wouldn't want me to be your intelligence officer. Keep the morals out of intelligence. Keep the truth in, and stay away from disinformation.
It would have been more appropriate for Mr. Trudeau, Prime Minister of Canada, to address this House according to Article 144, an article which was specifically designed to debate violations of human rights, democracy, and the rule of law, which is clearly the case with Mr. Trudeau. Then again, a Prime Minister who openly admires the Chinese basic dictatorship, who tramples on fundamental rights by persecuting and criminalizing his own citizens as terrorists just because they dared to stand up to his perverted concept of democracy, should not be allowed to speak in this House at all. Mr. Trudeau, you are a disgrace for any democracy. Please spare us your presence. Thank you.
And it might sound radical, colleagues, but the answer to war is not more war, it's peace. And peace isn't delivered by the barrel of a gun, it's delivered by diplomacy, by dialogue. You can wish away your continent's history, but we share a continent with Russia. We will sit down with Russia. There will be a negotiated peace, and this organisation should be promoting it earlier rather than delaying it and making sure that more Ukrainians die. Your feigning of sympathy rings hollow. It makes me sick, to be honest with you.
We become involved when disinformation poses a threat to the security of our country. It is when there's a connectivity to a threat to our country. It could be a threat, a connectivity to violence. And what this working group does, is precisely what I would think you would want it to do, which is to take a look at the work, the disinformation work that our department has done, and ask the following questions. Do we have policies? Do we have guardrails? Do we have standards?
But here's the problem. We can't even agree. We can't even agree what disinformation is. You can't even agree that it was disinformation, that the Russians fed information to the Steele dossier. If you can't agree to that, how are we ever going to come to an agreement on what is disinformation so you can police it on social media?
Senator, I have 2 points, if I may finish. Number one, that what this office, what this working group does, because it's not an office, what this working group does is ensure that there are guardrails definitions, standards to make sure that the free speech rights, the civil rights, civil liberties, and privacy rights of individuals
So
are
do you
not
think
impinged.
do you think
Number
COVID
one.
do you think
And
COVID
number
do you think
two,
COVID
if I may,
do you think COVID disinformation threatens our national security?
And number two, if I may, Senator, and number two, is it your proposition that when the cartels spread disinformation with respect to our immigration policies to try to lure vulnerable migrants to our border illegally?
I think you've got no idea what disinformation is, and I don't think the government's capable of it. Do you know who the greatest propagator of disinformation in the history of the world is? The U.S. government. Are you familiar with McNamara, the Pentagon Papers? Are you familiar with George W. Bush and the weapons of mass destruction? Are you familiar with Iran-Contra? I mean, think of all the debates and disputes we've had over the last 50 years in our country. We work them out by debating them. We don't work them out by the government being the arbiter. I don't want you guardrails. I want you to have nothing to do with speech. You think we can't determine, speech by traffickers is disinformation? You think the American people are so stupid they need you to tell them what the truth is? You can't even admit what the truth is with the Steele dossier. I don't trust government to figure out what the truth is. Government is largely disseminating disinformation.
You would know this this is a bit of an aside, but in terms of how you think about problem sets, when I was a cadet, what's the cadet motto at West Point? You will not lie, cheat, or steal, or tolerate those who do. I was the CIA director. We lied, we cheated, we stole. It was like we had entire training courses.
We had a good discussion on ensuring global energy security and adequate oil supplies to support global economic growth, and that will begin shortly. I'm doing all I can to increase the supply for the United States of America, which I expect to happen. The Saudis share that urgency, and based on our discussions today, I expect we'll see further steps in the coming weeks.
Are you worried about
Hey everyone, just as a reminder, our show starts at 4 p.m. Eastern Time, just a few minutes from now, but I should remind you that we have a daily newsletter. It's totally free. Natalie and I work very hard on it every morning over a cup of coffee, putting the stories together that we think are important that the mainstream media is going to ignore. All you need to do is go to our website. It's just redacted.inc. Put in your email address. We won't ever sell your email to anybody. And then you'll receive a welcome email. And all you need to do is verify that email, and 7 a.m. Eastern Time is when we send out our daily newsletter. And it's about 5 or 10 minutes in length that you can read it over your cup of coffee. And like I said, we cover 4 or 5 of the big stories of the day, plus a couple of things you might have missed while you were sleeping. We try to have some fun with it, add a little humor into it. And again, it's a great way to start off your morning. But it's also a great way for us to stay connected with you as well, because we've been banned and blocked on some of these platforms before, where we haven't been allowed to post anything, not even a community post. So the only way for us to stay connected with you is through our newsletter. We were able to send out a newsletter and say, hey everyone, we're blocked for the next week, and let you know what was actually going on with our show. Anyway, go to redacted.inc and sign up for the free newsletter, and it'll be posted first thing in the morning over your cup of coffee.
One of the hopeful things that I've discovered is that nearly every war that has started in the past 50 years has been a result of media lies. The media could have stopped it if they had searched deep enough. If they hadn't reprinted government propaganda, they could have stopped it. But what does that mean? Well, that means basically populations don't like wars. And populations have to be fooled into wars. Populations don't willingly and with open eyes go into a war. So if we have a good media environment, then we'll also have a peaceful environment.
You killed a million people in Iraq.
That is a separate...
You killed a million people in Iraq. It's incredible that you have the brass neck to be sitting here now urging another Iraq war
George,
after
if
what
I
you've
was
already
still in
done.
Parliament,
There can be no doubt that Saddam Hussein has biological weapons and the capability to rapidly produce more, many more. And he has the ability to dispense these lethal poisons and diseases in ways that can cause massive death and destruction. If biological weapons seem too terrible to contemplate, chemical weapons are equally chilling. UNMOVIC already laid out much of this, and it is documented for all of us to read in UNSCOM's 1999 report on the subject. If we consider just one category of missing weaponry, 6,500 bombs from the Iran-Iraq war, UNMOVIC says the amount of chemical agent in them would be on the order of 1,000 tons. These quantities of chemical weapons are now unaccounted for. Dr. Blick says, quipped that, quote, mustard gas is not marmalade. You are supposed to know what you did with it. We believe Saddam Hussein knows what he did with it, and he has not come clean to the international community. We have evidence these weapons existed. What we don't have is evidence from Iraq that they have been destroyed or where they are. That is what we are still waiting for.
Okay, inspection worth doing, everybody's agreed it's worth doing, and it gets stopped.
Yes, sir.
At that moment, we're an automatic pilot as far as you're concerned. Period. No ifs, ands, or buts. Now, I respect that. But now, it seems to me the Secretary of State might have a slightly different problem. Secretary of State might be sitting there and saying, now look over there on that side. Now, I remember so-and-so and so-and-so and so-and-so, and the 12 people on this side, they're all the ones that said they didn't want to use force. Now, I'm going to have to go tell the president now that we should, or Secretary Cohen, unleash whatever it takes to get it done. And our military assessment is the same as the majors. The majors' assessment is, privately held but publicly acknowledged later, that airstrikes alone aren't going to do this. Saddam's not going to cave on this. So, now here's the deal. I recommended the president have at it and let the chips fall where they may. A reasonable position for the Secretary of Defense, the Secretary of State to take. But I respectfully suggest, Major, I respectfully suggest they have a responsibility slightly above your pay grade. Slightly above your pay grade. To decide whether or not to take the nation to war alone, or to take the nation to war partway, or to take the nation to war halfway. That's a real tough decision. That's why they get paid the big bucks. That's why they get the limos and you don't. I mean this sincerely. I'm not trying to be flip, because I think, and that's why I said at the outset, the reason why I'm glad you did what you did, we should come to our milk. We should make a decision. But in terms of whether the Secretary of State has no more to consider than you do as the arms inspector. You didn't get in, didn't get my job done, get me in. Period. You made the deal, right? That's the deal. A deal's a deal. Get me in. Scott Ritter, I'm ready to go. It's not how it works. Now, maybe it should work that way. But wouldn't you acknowledge that if you were President of the United States or the Secretary of State, you'd sit there and say, now, okay, old Scotty boy didn't get in. We said he should get in. We want him to get in. It's important that he does get in. They're not going to let him in. So what are we going to do now? We know that France and Russia aren't going to be with us. We're quite confident China's not. We've already run those traps. They're not there. We're not sure where the United States Senate is, but have at it, boys. Go get them. And by the way, Scott and the boys say air power's not enough. I think it's a legitimate debate, Major. I think it's a legitimate debate. But I don't think we should be putting it in the context of, you have somebody up there at state saying, look, how can we weasel out of this agreement? We want to let this guy out there hanging. We're not this. It's a very practical political decision. Same kind of decision General Powell made. Same kind of decision President Bush made. Every president, every Secretary of State has to do it. Like I said, they get paid more than you. Their job's a hell of a lot more complicated than yours. They may have made the wrong decision, and you brought it to light. We should address it. We should say straight up where we are, and we should do it. And for that, I thank you. But it's above your pay grade.
About 10 days after 9/11, I went through the Pentagon, and one of the generals called me and he said, "Sir, you got to come in and talk to me a second." He says, "We've made the decision. We're going to war with Iraq." I said, "We're going to war with Iraq? Why?" He said, "I don't know." He said, "I guess they don't know what else to do." He said, "I guess it's like we don't know what to do about terrorists, but we got a good military and we can take down governments." And he said, "I guess if the only tool you have is a hammer, every problem has to look like a nail." So I came back to see him a few weeks later, and by that time we were bombing in Afghanistan. I said, "Are we still going to war with Iraq?" And he said, "Oh, it's worse than that." He reached over on his desk, he picked up a piece of paper. He said, "I just got this down from upstairs," meaning the Secretary of Defense's office today, and he said, "This is a memo that describes how we're going to take out 7 countries in 5 years, starting with Iraq and then Syria, Lebanon, Libya, Somalia, Sudan, and finishing off Iran."
Hey everyone, Clayton here. The show is going to start at 4 p.m. Eastern Time. I should remind you that we have a VIP community. It's our Redacted Rebel VIP community. Now, this show is totally free, what you're watching right now, right? You can subscribe here on YouTube and Rumble, totally free. But if you'd like to support independent journalism, we are run by you. Without you guys, we wouldn't be able to do this show. We wouldn't be able to hire the team that we have. We wouldn't be able to afford the servers that we have. We wouldn't be able to afford the reporters that we have, the team that we have. So you can support us by going to redacted.inc, and on the right side of your screen, you'll see a VIP community button. Just click that, and for the price of a cup of coffee once a month, you can support us. We put out exclusive content, early interviews that no one else will see, live streams just for our VIP Rebel community. So again, it's totally free to watch this show, but if you do want to support independent journalism, we would really appreciate it. Come on over to redacted.inc, click on that community button, and decide if you want to sign up or not. It's totally up to you. We thank you. And meanwhile, the show will start in just a few moments at 4 p.m. Eastern Time.
Well, one of the 4 principal functions of the CIA is to gather intelligence and ideally forward it to the president, the users of information, the policymakers, as they say. There are other functions, however, some of them more legitimate than others. One is to run secret wars, the covert action that's written and talked about so much, like what's happening in Nicaragua today from Honduras. Another thing is to disseminate propaganda to influence people's minds, and this is a major function of the CIA. And unfortunately, of course, it overlaps into the gathering of information. You have contact with a journalist, you will give him true stories, you'll get information from him, you'll also give him false stories. For example, in my war, the Angola war that I helped to manage, 1/3 of my staff was propaganda. Ironically, it's called covert action inside the CIA. Outside, that means the violent part. I had propagandists all over the world, principally in London, Kinshasa, and Zambia. We would take stories which we would write and put them in the Zambia Time, and then pull them out and send them to a journalist on our payroll in Europe. But his cover story, you see, would be that he'd gotten them from his stringer in Lusaka, who had gotten them from the Zambia Time. We had the complicity of the government of Zambia, Kenneth Kaunda, if you will, to put these false stories into his newspapers. But after that point, the journalists, Reuters and AFP, the management was not witting of it. Now, our contact man in Europe was, and we pumped just dozens of stories about Cuban atrocities, Cuban rapists. In one case, we had the Cuban rapists caught and tried by the Ovimbundu maidens who had been their victims, and then we ran photographs that made almost every newspaper in the country of the Cubans being executed by the Ovimbunda women who supposedly had been their victims.
These were fake photos?
Oh, absolutely. We didn't know of one single atrocity committed by the Cubans. It was pure, raw, false propaganda to create an illusion of communists, eating babies for breakfast and that sort of totally false propaganda.
The only reason that I'm allowed to ask you this question is because today the federal court ruled that the government doesn't have the right to determine who is or is not a journalist. This is the second election in a row that the court had to overturn your government. Do you still insist on being able to make that decision, and why?
First of all, questions around accreditation were handled by the press gallery and the consortium of networks who have strong perspectives on quality journalism and the important information that is shared with Canadians. The reality is organizations like yours that continue to spread misinformation and disinformation on the science around vaccines, around how we're going to actually get through this pandemic and be there for each other and keep our kids safe, is part of why we're seeing such unfortunate anger and lack of understanding of basic science. And quite frankly, I won't call it a media organization, your group of individuals need to take accountability for some of the polarization that we're seeing in this country. And I think Canadians are cluing into the fact that there is a really important decision we take about the kind of country we want to see. And I salute all extraordinary, hardworking journalists that put science and facts at the heart of what they do and ask me tough questions every day, but make sure that they are educating and informing Canadians from a broad range of perspectives, which is the last thing that you guys do.
Whatever our hopes may be for the future, for reducing this threat or living with it, there is no escaping either the gravity or the totality of its challenge to our survival and to our security. A challenge that confronts us in unaccustomed ways in every sphere of human activity. This deadly challenge imposes upon our society two requirements of direct concern, both to the press and to the President. Two requirements that may seem almost contradictory in tone, but which must be reconciled and fulfilled if we are to meet this national peril. I refer first to the need for far greater public information, and second, to the need for far greater official secrecy. The very word secrecy is repugnant in a free and open society, and we are, as a people, inherently and historically opposed to secret societies, to secret oaths, and to secret proceedings. We decided long ago that the dangers of excessive and unwarranted concealment of pertinent facts far outweighed the dangers which are cited to justify it. Even today, there is little value in opposing the threat of a closed society by imitating its arbitrary restrictions. Even today, there is little value in ensuring the survival of our nation if our traditions do not survive with it. And there is very grave danger that an announced need for increased security will be seized upon by those anxious to expand its meaning to the very limits of official censorship and concealment. That I do not intend to permit to the extent that it's in my control. And no official of my administration, whether his rank is high or low, civilian or military, should interpret my words here tonight as an excuse to censor the news, to stifle dissent, to cover up our mistakes, or to withhold from the press and the public the facts they deserve to know.
Welcome, everybody, to Redacted on this Wednesday night. I'm Clayton Morris. So glad to have all of you here. Philip is here. David is here. Grim is here. The whole team is here. Natalie's not here. She has the night off tonight. And sadly, though, because we are here on a big night, I can't believe this, just passed 2 million subscribers. This is unbelievable. 2 million. Can you believe it? Wow. Unbelievable. 2 million and gold flakes falling out of the sky. That's on YouTube. So thanks to the many hundreds of thousands of you that are also joining us live on Rumble as well. We hit 350,000 on Rumble today at the same time. Isn't that crazy? So we hit 2 million on YouTube, 350,000 on Rumble. And we only just recently started on Rumble. So thank you from the bottom of our hearts for all of you truth seekers out there. Again, we don't always have the answers. Our goal is, to be part of this journey and to seek the truth here, covering the stories the mainstream media ignores, the stuff that's being kept from you, being redacted from you. So again, thank you so much for subscribing. It really means the world to us. And we are not paid for by Pfizer or any biopharmaceutical companies or BlackRock or anybody. So we are supported by you. So thank you guys so much. Having said that, we have a very busy show for you on this Wednesday. We put a lot of hard work into tonight's show. We're going to look at, will Putin use nuclear weapons? That's what Biden seems to suggest. And the timing of it is very interesting, isn't it? That he mentions this on the very day that his son is charged with federal crimes. Distraction. Now that, my friend, is a distraction. So we'll look at that. Plus, all of Europe seems to be coming together to support the war, wants to throw even more money into this war. And maybe Rishi Sunak, UK Prime Minister, revealed the true intentions of throwing all of this money into Ukraine. So we'll look at that. Also, Kit Clarenberg is going to be joining us from the Gray Zone with a bombshell new report on NATO's terrorist armies, which go back to post-World War II. How has NATO used these terrorist armies around the world to foment chaos in order for us to need NATO? Hey, there's people terrorizing your towns that we put there. Don't you need us? Don't you need us, NATO, to come protect you? It's a great strategy, right? Create the chaos so that you need us. We're going to look at these explosive new documents from the Gray Zone as we go through that. Also, a member of Canada's Parliament has come forward and sent a letter to the Defense Ministry in Canada saying, hey, we know that we have crashed UFOs. Why are we not being put to the table with the United States, New Zealand, and Australia, which are actively reverse engineering these craft? We're going to dive deep into what this Canadian member of Parliament has released in a brand new letter. We are getting very close, my friends, very close to seeing some of these materials, and it is going to be a game changer when that happens. Also, Natalie's not here, but she did file a great report on cow farts. That's right. So, you know the argument, right? The World Economic Forum and the left uses to push us away from eating meat is that cows, the methane, that's what's making our atmosphere so hot, so we need to eliminate all the cattle. That's exactly what they're trying to do in the Netherlands. That's exactly what they're trying to do in other parts of the world. Get rid of all the cattle. Cull the cattle so that we can have a clean air, I guess. We have a special guest on the show tonight, a rancher from Wyoming, who's on the forefront of this debate and knows a thing or two about raising cattle, and is going to break some wind with that story a little bit later in the show. All of that and more as Redacted starts right now. Welcome, everybody, to the big show on this first day of summer, by the way. It's the first day of summer. It's kind of crazy weather. I know a lot of people on the East Coast have been dealing with... how many people here watching right now are on the East Coast of the United States? Actually, let us know in the chat where you're joining us from. On Rumble and YouTube and Twitter tonight, let us know where you're joining us from. I know the East Coast of the United States has had some crazy weather. It's been cold. I know my sister and my mom are heading to the beach in the next week, and they're worried that it's going to be cold and rainy. What about you guys out on the West Coast? You guys are out in the Pacific Northwest.
Here the Pacific Northwest. It's been actually kind of cold and rainy So today's like the
our
sun
first,
kind of
really
wants
nice
to come
day.
out, but
It's
yeah.
72 today and sunny, so that's a relief. First day of summer, so that's good.
And I know in other parts of the world right now, a heat wave. So in Texas, big heat wave going through there, and the state of Texas is telling people turn off your electricity in Texas. So we've got that to deal with. So anyway, it is the first day of summer. It's the longest day of the year, the summer solstice. The summer solstice. So on the summer solstice, we have a free newsletter we want to tell you about. If you're not already subscribed to it, so here's the thing. I know that millions of you are subscribers to our show here, but many of you are not even subscribed to our daily newsletter. What are you waiting for? It's totally free, and it brings you a ton of value first thing in the morning. We don't do anything with your email address other than provide you with a great email newsletter every morning. And in the newsletter, we cover about... Yeah, Grover. Grover, what the heck? Thank you, man. Grover reads the newsletter every morning. There's a doggy edition of the newsletter that he reads, and it's fantastic. And we cover like 4 or 5 of the big stories of the day that the mainstream media largely ignores. We had a bunch of stories in there today that the mainstream media won't even touch. So please subscribe. All you need to do to subscribe to the newsletter is go to redacted.inc. It's not .com, it's .inc. Put in your email address, and then tomorrow morning, on Thursday morning, you will receive the newsletter about 7 a.m. Eastern Time to start your day over your cup of coffee. It's the perfect way to start your day with our newsletter. So if you're just joining us again, we just passed 2 million subscribers. So much love to all of you guys. Thank you guys for being a part of the Redacted community. We really appreciate it. Thank you guys so much. All right, let's get to your top story now, which is the war in Ukraine. President Biden traveling, just announcing that, hey, President Putin could be getting ready to use nuclear weapons. He says this really without any evidence at all. He made this announcement on the very same day, by the way, that his son, Hunter Biden, was charged with federal crimes. So I guess take that with a grain of salt. And hey, if, by the way, if you think that President Putin is going to use tactical nuclear weapons against the United States or NATO forces or even Ukrainian forces, like you're saying that, could literally kill 60,000 people in the blink of an eye with some sort of a tactical nuclear weapon. So maybe now would be a good time for peace talks. Just saying, right? If you're saying this, then why on the very same day, literally Anthony Blinken then rolls out and says they're going to roll out another $1.3 billion to Ukraine. So the president says, he could be using nukes if when this gets out of hand. It already is out of hand. So NATO, pack up your shit and go home. There's an idea for you.
Yeah, just adhere to the original document you already signed, Ukraine.
Yeah, remember that peace agreement? You need me to send it over via email as a PDF attachment? Here's the peace agreement that you bozos signed. It would have ended all of this. No. By the way, the guy that signs that peace agreement ends up getting killed later on, we learned. So as a result of this message from President Biden, international community sprang into action. Oh, nukes? Here's an idea. Instead of peace, what we'll do? We'll just throw more money and more weapons. That was the message all across Europe today. From sea to shining sea was the message all across the world. So I was watching all of these different countries today, going through their different press secretaries and meetings and pulling together all this information today. It's crazy. So more weapons, more money, more corrupt. We're going to stand by Ukraine, the most corrupt country in Europe, and throw more money at them. Well, we don't know where it all went anyway. We have no accounting of it. A country that will soon become part of the EU, we're now hearing today. On top of all of this, according to German's warmonger, Baerbock. So yes, the defense minister from Germany, Baerbock. You know her. You love her. She's the one who famously stood up on stage and said, I care more about Ukraine than I do the German voters. Remember that? It's one of Philip's favorite sound bites of the past year. So here she is again. Here she is again. So she's really emphatic how much she loves Ukraine and how Germany will stand with adding more money and more weapons to Ukraine because Ukraine must win and become a member of the EU. Listen.
We continue to support Ukraine financially, politically, with weapons. We want Ukraine to win this war, to win peace. That is why we have made clear that Ukraine belongs also to the European family. And the Commission President, Ursula von der Leyen, said this morning that the European Commission on Ukraine's reform efforts shows that Ukraine is making commendable progress despite the war. And Ukraine will eventually become a member of the European Union.
Thank you, Foreign Minister. I said Defense Minister, I meant Foreign Minister. And I love how she called her Ursula von der Leyen. Did you hear that? Or von der Leyen? Von der Leyen. Thank you. Thank you. I know English is not your first language, Baerbock, but you sure talk like it is. You seem pretty emphatic and very straightforward when you want us, and you underlining it, pausing, letting us know that Ukraine will become a part of the European Union. Just like Ursula von der Leyen said today. So what did Ursula von der Leyen say today? Well, Ursula von der Leyen said Ukraine is fighting for us. I didn't realize that. To be honest with you, I didn't realize that. I thought they were fighting. Well, first, I don't know why they are. To be honest with you, but
well, it's for democracy, which is all of us. We all have to care about democracy.
Then von der Leyen
and American tradition and values.
Then von der Leyen is right. Then I guess Ukraine is fighting for us, according to von der Leyen, whose hair hasn't moved since the 1980s. Watch.
Because Ukrainians are fighting not just for their sovereignty, but we've just heard it also for us, for our values, for our freedom, for our democracies. We can never match their sacrifice.
Yeah. So they're just at night when you go to bed, you're tucking your kids in. I want you to remember that Ukraine is fighting for you. Ukraine's fighting for you. Okay. Now, this could be the greatest reason in all of this to never pay taxes again because of what the United States has uncovered. The Pentagon announced an accounting error last night, just a small rounding error. Like when you make a mistake on your taxes, you're off by like $100. Like we've all made mistakes like that. A decimal point, you've made a mistake trying to balance your checkbook and you're like, where is that 13 cents? I cannot find it. I've been over this checkbook for the last month. I can't find that 13 cents. Well, the Pentagon made an accounting error that they admitted yesterday, that they accidentally sent Ukraine an extra $6.2 billion. Whoops. You can't make this up. Here's the Pentagon admitting this rounding error. Watch.
Following up from some announcements earlier this year, during the department's regular oversight of our execution of Presidential Drawdown Authority for Ukraine, we discovered inconsistencies in equipment valuation for Ukraine. In a significant number of cases, services used replacement costs rather than net book value, thereby overestimating the value of the equipment drawn down from U.S. stocks and provided to Ukraine. Once we discovered this misvaluation, the comptroller reissued guidance on March 31st, clarifying how to value equipment in line with the Financial Management Regulation and DoD policy to ensure we use the most accurate of accounting methods. We have confirmed that for FY23, the final calculation is $3.6 billion, and for FY22, it is $2.6 billion, for a combined total of $6.2 billion. These valuation errors in no way limit or restricted the size of any of our PDAs or impacted the provision of support to Ukraine. And while the DoD retains the authority to utilize the recaptured PDA, this has no bearing on appropriated USAI or Ukraine PDA replenishment funding approved by Congress.
So we're just off by $6.2 billion, Sorry. So when we hired 87,000 new IRS agents to come after you for making a $500 mistake, or failing to report the wages that you got from working at the TGI Fridays from your tips. Just want you to know that we at the Pentagon were off by $6.2 billion that we're sending them. We're sorry about that.
Yeah, I'm gonna start doing my taxes that way. Just when I factor in like how much of my apartment is the office that I use, for my business, I'm just gonna like, oh shoot, it wasn't $134,000 a month. My bad.
Right.
Bad. I'm sure I wouldn't end up in jail for that.
Yeah, no, I'm sure you'll be like Hunter Biden. You'll be totally fine. Don't worry about it. Don't worry about it.
if the Pentagon's gonna be this good with money, like why do we keep sending them? Because like remember when the section of the Pentagon that was destroyed on 9/11 happened to be where the trillions of dollars were missing? That what was that? What was the guy's name that was the defense secretary then?
Rumsfeld.
Rumsfeld. He's like, you don't know where it went. It's like, what? Yeah. So how did they keep losing money at the Pentagon?
Yeah, you know that section of the building that was blown up? And you know that section of the building where we couldn't find there was no evidence of a plane? We didn't see any planes. You know that section of the building that was blown up? Yeah, all the files were in that part of the building. Went up in flames about a rat. All of that's missing. How does that happen? They're playing us for fools.
Or section of the Pentagon.
They're playing us for fools. But on top of which, if you unpacked actually what she said, what she admitted there, is that basically we overcalculated the value of the equipment we were sending to Ukraine. In other words, the stuff we've been sending to Ukraine is in large part has been crap. So, in other words, and this was acknowledged in recent reports this week, that a lot of the Western weapons that have been sent to Ukraine, sorry, did I say Iraq? What we've been sending to Ukraine haven't worked. Broken pieces on purpose, like they've known. And so the conspiracy theorist in me, which you know what we say about conspiracy theories, right? It's just, it's spoiler alerts for what's going to be actually true in 3 months. What we're going to find out in 3 months is that, so you've been sending a lot of broken weapons. You probably were doing that by mistake, right? What we'll learn in 3 months, there'll be some Wall Street Journal piece, but we're saying it here because we already know it, is that these countries are getting rid of all of their old broken equipment and sending it to Ukraine so they can replenish it for peanuts through Raytheon, Boeing, Northrop Grumman, and otherwise. And so the military-industrial complex will make all kinds of money. So it's just a way of like spring cleaning, basically. Send your crap to Ukraine.
Yeah, well, She just admitted, and the one thing she didn't say in all of that was that they said that they undervalued this equipment by $6.2 billion. But that means we bought the equipment and sent it. So essentially, that $6.2 billion, she didn't say anything about anybody paying that back. So where does that go? So that means they're just like, oh no, this was undervalued. So we're just, whoops, we're just going to erase that $6.2 billion. No, it's in somebody's pocket, and they didn't make any mention of them bringing it back.
Yeah. But hey, you know what? Their solution, the liberals, their solution is go after people like Elon Musk and make him pay more. Like that's the solution. Not stop the criminality that's unfolding right in the government and where this money is going. Like imagine if we didn't have this entire, like a leaky toilet every day of this money just being flushed down the toilet. Imagine, would you then have to stand at a podium and say, we need to go after people like Elon Musk and make billionaires pay their fair share? Okay. That's the solution. Rishi Sunak was at the Ukraine Reconstruction Conference. Did you guys, how many people in the chat got an invitation to the Ukrainian Reconstruction Conference? I'd love to know who.
That's what that was.
I'd love to, you threw that away. I'd love to know who foot the bill for the Ukrainian Reconstruction Conference to fly all these dignitaries and people in there to basically shovel more money at Ukraine. BlackRock? BlackRock fund this?
It's the Halliburton days all over again.
Yeah.
During the Iraq war, where like Halliburton was charging like, $100 to do little bags of laundry. They charge like $50 for a Coke, stuff like that. It's those days again. They're like, what can we get our hands on? We're going to be shipping all this stuff over there. How can we make our money?
Did you see in the newsletter this morning, we had a story about how they're charging $50,000 for airplane trash cans to the U.S. government. Yeah. So the Department of Defense is for a trash can that goes into the airplane. The little ones. By the way, these are the trash cans that you can't fit anything in when you go in the bathroom of an airplane. You try to put like a paper towel in there, and your hand gets stuck with those like little flappy things. You're like $50,000. That's what they're charging us.
I wouldn't even think a black box would cost $50,000.
Right. It costs more than the black box.
Right.
So Rishi Sunak was at the Ukraine Reconstruction Conference today and provides the real reason that we're pumping so much money into Ukraine. I don't know that he wanted to admit this publicly, but I think you could read between the lines. Watch.
During the winter, Russia tried to destroy Ukraine's energy grid. By February, over 40% of power generation was down. But now, because of that incredible ingenuity and defiance, Ukraine has got the grid back online, and they're even able to start exporting electricity back to Europe. As we've seen in Bakhmut and Mariupol, what Russia cannot take, it will seek to destroy. They want to do the same to Ukraine's economy. And the scale of the challenge is real.
So I see. Sorry, I hit the wrong button there. So that's the problem. So you see what's going on here? You want to connect the dots here? You want to pull this puzzle together and understand how all of these things come together? When you hear that we're going to continue to funnel billions of dollars into Ukraine, but we will not let them become a member of NATO, but we will let them become a member of the EU. We will exploit their resources, right? We will let them build their electric grid so they can send more resources back to us to send it to Europe. It's the first thing he said. We're so excited they got their electric grid back on, not for their own people, but so they can start sending it to Europe again. And your grain and all of the other stuff that we rely on out of Ukraine. Like, let's get that up and running again. That's why BlackRock is so excited about this. That's why James O'Keefe's piece from OMG Media over the past 24 hours has been such a bombshell. These undercover investigation of BlackRock employees who have admitted now on camera that the war is good for BlackRock. Profits are through the roof. Of course it is, because they're bankrolling it. And of course, as they've met with and flown in and met with Vladimir Zelensky in Kiev, they're buying up half the country. It's an amazing opportunity. It's an amazing opportunity to be able to invest and also buy up large pieces of this country right now. So that's the real puzzle. It's all coming together. We won't let them become a part of NATO. Like, if you really care about their defense, NATO, then why not make them a member? But you won't, for obvious reasons. We want Ukraine to win this war, they say. Ukraine belongs to the European family, they say, and will eventually become an EU member. Earlier, past 24 hours, Atlantic writer Anne Applebaum, wife of the ex-Polish diplomat who openly thanked the United States, of course. Remember that famous tweet after the United States blew up the Nord Stream pipeline? That Polish diplomat posted a tweet with a picture of the blown up pipeline that said, "Thanks, United States." His wife is Anne Applebaum, who is, of course, a Russophobia expert, and was on CNN. I love the experts that CNN gets to ask about the war. Like, you know her history, you know her politics. Why are you asking her a question about Russia's motivations here? And says that, you know what, we need to send more F-16s to Ukraine because an F-16 equals diplomacy. Like, that's how we get to the peace table, is by sending F-16s. But wait a second, didn't we already have a peace agreement that was already signed? So now we need to send weapons in order to get us back to the peace table? Do you see how this makes zero sense? Here's Anne Applebaum.
Do the Russians have this capacity to just take the pain and put more troops through the meat grinder and just keep going?
Well, as I said, one of the things the Ukrainians are trying to do is to convince them that that won't happen. But there's also some diplomacy about that. So why is the U.S. giving Ukraine F-16s, which has now been announced? Why did the Germans finally decide to give Ukraine tanks? Of course, there are military reasons for that, but those are also signs to Russia that we aren't going to stop. In other words, you can keep your war going, and we are also going to keep the war going.
Okay. So I just want to understand this. Help me understand the logic of this. Like, in order for diplomacy to happen, we need to send F-16s to Ukraine that will be blown up upon landing there. There's no pilots to fly them. So this is how we get back to the negotiating table, by sending as many weapons as possible into Ukraine. Okay.
I mean, bear with me for a second here, but one, that's not diplomacy, because like if they're basically if your idea of diplomacy is let's perpetuate this war for eternity, that is not diplomacy.
Right.
And second, like it's not even like the idea of mutually assured destruction is how nuclear weapons ended up being diplomacy, because nobody could use them because the people that we were trying to negotiate with also had them. Ukraine doesn't have them. Russia does. So an F-16 cannot then be used to say, like, well, look, we've got all these fighter jets. And they're like, yeah, but we have nukes. So, I mean, if we really wanted to do that, then we would arm Ukraine with nukes.
Right. And maybe that's next. And maybe that's the next step.
You know, it's so like if you lay this on over Iraq and Afghanistan, right? It's like the exact same playbook. It's like they had all of this hype going into it, like weapons of mass destruction, this, that, we got to go over there, and everybody was in support of it. But like over the years, that support has waned and waned and waned, and more people are like, why are we still there? Why are we still there? We got to get out of there. And it's like they needed something else to be able to put that money into. And this is like the perfect thing for them to do the same thing. This is going to be one of those, another forever war, because if it wasn't about that, they would be looking for peace and they would make them part of NATO. Like they would do the things that would make this go away, right? But they're not doing that. They're not willing to do it. So it's just Afghanistan all over again.
Well, and you bring up a great point, which is what RFK Jr. said yesterday. And I want to go to this next, Philip. Presidential candidate Robert F. Kennedy Jr. gave a speech Tuesday night. And here's the thing, right? The idea that a president of the United States should do everything in his or her power, to keep us out of war instead of putting us further into wars. And can you imagine a candidate saying this, someone calling this out? So here's RFK saying that this idea of Putin is going to be using nuclear weapons now. This idea of using nuclear war to ratchet up to peace. Like, that makes absolutely no sense. Listen.
John Quincy Adams spoke for all of them when he said, America goes not abroad in search of monsters to destroy. Today, I want to recall that memory because this forever war, which has so drained our nation's vitality, now threatens to plunge the world into the unspeakable horror of nuclear Armageddon. And I speak, of course, of the situation in Ukraine. I abhor Russia's brutal and bloody invasion of that nation. But we must understand that our government has also contributed to its circumstances through repeated, deliberate provocations of Russia going back to the 1990s. Democratic and Republican administrations have pushed NATO to Russia's borders, violating our own solemn promise from the early 90s when we pledged that if Russia made this terrible concession of moving 400,000 troops out of East Germany and allowing the unification of Germany under a NATO army, a hostile army, that we would commit that after that we would not move NATO 1 inch to the east. And James Baker gave that assurance, as did the British government officials and many, many others. And yet today we have surrounded Russia. We have moved it not 1 inch to the east, but 1,000 miles and 14 nations. We have surrounded Russia with missiles and military bases, something that we would never tolerate if the Russians did that to us.
Yeah, how would we react, actually, if Russia started building military bases in Canada?
Oh, we know how we'd react. They'd be wiped off the face of the earth.
Yeah, it would never happen. Would never happen.
What's the only country in the world that's ever used nukes on a country?
It's hard to say. Hard to say.
But I want to say one thing about what he said. I kind of disagree. I mean, I agree with what he said, but there's a little bit more. Like, he didn't say, like, van der Leyen in her little speech there said that the Ukraine have done the ultimate sacrifice and we could never match that. But think about the sacrifice that Russia made, the Russians made during World War II. And the biggest, like, slap in the face we could have given them is we created NATO right after that. It's like they sacrificed to help win this world war. They helped the entire world. And then we started NATO to keep, to kind of basically keep control of them. So we've been messing with them and provoking them since back then, not just in the 90s. I mean, I agree with what he's saying in the 90s, but it goes back further, in my opinion.
Oh, it goes right back to the armistice. You know, it's dividing Germany, right, east and west.
Well, I've seen arguments that the only reason we dropped nukes to begin with was to show Russia we had them and to keep them from encroaching on Japan and Korea.
Well, yeah, and China,
or basically out of Korea, yeah.
Yeah, and China. It was to show, hey, China and to the Soviet Union. Yeah. In fact, if you look at the details of this, it's it's highly reported now. And you can even read Malcolm Gladwell's brand new book. He just wrote a recent book on all of the fire bombings of Tokyo, the air fire bombings of Tokyo. I mean, they were on their knees. The napalm bombings. We were destroying Japan. And they had actually submitted a peace agreement that we ignored. So peace was already being talked about, and a surrender agreement was already being put forth by Japan.
That reminds me of that Simpsons episode where that guy's like, "Those white flags are no match for our muskets."
Yeah, that's exactly like, we surrender. You've burned all of our towns. You've burned all of our villages with your air raids that have worked, as Malcolm Gladwell writes in his most recent book. Beyond the nuke was there as a show of force for the future. You're absolutely right about that, Philip. That's well documented. So he began his speech last night, RFK Jr. And some people in the chat say he's great. Others say, I saw one person say he's a snake. Hey, just listen to his words. We'll see. And we'll see through actions here, right? We want to show you all sides of this. So we're not taking sides on this. But who else is saying this? What other candidate is saying this right now? He began his speech last night by reminding us that Russia, who won World War II, and that 1 in 7 Russians died fighting the Nazis, and that they have security concerns as well. Can you imagine? And that his uncle, former President Kennedy, helped Americans sympathize with Russia to make progress in the Cold War, not hate them. He said this. He warned of this war rhetoric being extended throughout China. And he warned us that we're choosing politicians that win with war rhetoric. And if we want peace, we have to reject that from our leaders. Listen.
President Kennedy understood that peace begins with our basic attitudes and beliefs. He spoke of the futility of passively waiting for the other side to become enlightened. We, quote, we must examine our own attitudes, he said, as individuals and as a nation, for our attitude is as essential to theirs. End quote. We should, he said, begin by looking inward. Yes, back in 1963, a politician really said that. A political leader. A political leader voiced what would be considered today a spiritual maximum or a spiritual principle. Let's take up that call from 60 years ago and ask Americans, all of us, to re-examine our attitude. We have been immersed in a foreign policy discourse that is all about adversaries and threats and allies and enemies and domination. We've become addicted to comic book good versus evil narratives that erase complexity and blind us to the legitimate motives and the legitimate cultural and economic concerns and the legitimate security concerns of other peoples and other nations. We have internalized and institutionalized a reflex of violence as the response for any and all crises. Everything becomes a war. The war on drugs, the war on terror, the war on cancer, the war on climate change. This way of thinking predisposes us to wage endless wars abroad, wars and coups and bombs and drones and regime change operations and support for paramilitaries and juntas and dictators. None of this has made us safer, and none of it has burnished our leadership or our moral authority. But more importantly, we must ask ourselves, is this really who we are? Is this what we want to be? Is that what Americans' founders envisioned?
People in the chat wondering. Yeah, go ahead.
Go ahead.
No, I was going to say, people in the chat wondering, they're not fully clear on why his voice is like that. And you should know, like, if you're going to hear him speak more and more, it's incredibly painful for him to speak. He has what's known as spasmodic dysphonia, which is a neurological disorder which has the muscle contraction of the larynx. So it leads to this like hoarse voice. So it's like spazzing. Like imagine trying to speak when your larynx is like doing that all the time. So that's what
it's
he
almost
has.
like Parkinson's in the throat is what it is.
So he's had it for a number of years. I interviewed him a number of years ago after one of his books on the environment, on the waterways of outside of New York, and he didn't have that issue then when I interviewed him. So it has evolved over the years. So go ahead, you were going to say something.
Yeah, I was going to say, like, it's so simple. It's like Monsters Inc. And I've used this comparison or this analogy all the time. It's like all this time we've been going for scares. And it's like, that's what's filling our tanks. But then we've never tried laughter. We've never actually tried real peace and democracy. We've never tried it. Like when we did back in the early days, it worked well. But it's like, why can't we try that? And if we ever did, maybe that would be what would fill the tank better. Like maybe that would be better for the world if we got on board with actually like being a global force for good, for real.
No, you're watching America as a failed state right now, on the verge of collapse. $32 trillion in debt, it's arguably over $1 trillion a year now for our military budget. Unbelievable. A continued multiple endless wars. We are watching a failed state, and you can see it in action. All you need to do is go back to the Roman Empire to see exactly how this unfolds and exactly how the extension of the state, the pushing further as the military-industrial complex, the empire keeps pushing, devalues the currency. That's what the Roman Empire did, and then eventual collapse. And you're seeing it in action right before your eyes. This is so threatening to the establishment right now to hear. I love listening to it. Just like when Trump says things that go right against the establishment, tells neoconservatives that the Iraq war was an absolute joke and a total lie, and there was never weapons of mass destruction, and you lied to the American people. I loved when he said that. I loved watching Jeb Bush squirm to know that his corrupt Bush family complex, the media that support him, they are throwing their weight around trying to discredit RFK right now. It's fun. It's amazing to watch, actually. So you can see these hit pieces being drafted up. Where do they come from? Here's the LA Times this morning. Look at this, saying that he is a threat to your health. So RFK Jr. is a threat to your health and our democracy. Column, Robert F. Kennedy is a threat to your health and our democracy.
We can't have him in our election cycle. That's against our democracy.
And I love the LA Times. Yeah, we can only have people that we pick, because that's how a democracy works, apparently, according to the LA Times. And by the way, the LA Times, California, have you seen California lately? He's a threat. Do you know who your governor is? For crying out loud? Like, he's a threat, though. Okay. Did you, on your way into the LA Times in downtown Los Angeles, did you drive over a whole tent city on your way to get into work that yesterday morning? An entire homeless encampment underneath the bridge? But he's a threat. Okay. Anyway, the media is not your friend. They won't risk uncomfortable discussions about biopharmaceutical companies. They can't certainly let you hear any messages about peace. They won't do it, as evidenced by CNN having Ann Applebaum on the air, or any of these other warmongers. They are the enemy of the people with headlines like this, and totally shame on them. So we've got more news to get to here on your Wednesday. What day is it? Wednesday. First day of summer. Hope you have a great summer. Hope you have a wonderful summer planned. Spend time with your family. Hold them tight. Protect your family. That's the most important thing you can do right now. Take care of your family and take care of your community. We've got more news to get to. We're going to talk about these NATO terror armies. How many of you are familiar with NATO and their actual terrorist armies that they created? You might not know about it. You better stick around for this next segment. Kit Clarenberg is going to join us from the Gray Zone with a bombshell new report that the Gray Zone just published on these leaked documents. Well, actually, declassified documents that tie into how the UK government has been utilizing these terror armies with NATO and potentially in Ukraine. We'll talk about that. Also, we're going to talk about this UFO cover-up, and Canada's member of parliament has come forward to say, yeah, we have these craft. We've been reverse engineering them. Canada needs to be at the table with the United States, New Zealand, and Australia. Otherwise, they're going to be left behind. Well, we got a big guest on that one coming up in just a moment. But first, TacRite. Our sponsor today is TacRite. With their mini chainsaw, 50% off right now for our viewers. This weekend, I've got a lot of brush that I need to get out there and use my tack right for and take out some of these. There's a whole area that I need all these trees.
I wonder if that thing will cut through a steak, a T-bone.
Probably. It's 2 times faster, makes tree trimming 2 times faster. You can hold it with one hand, which is great. I mean, that's the old problem when you have these heavy chainsaws and you're like trying to, go against these branches that you're like losing your balance. So it's easy with one hand, and you don't have to deal with bulky chainsaws to get the job done. The new mini chainsaw is so small, it's mind-blowing. Thousands of Americans have bought this mini chainsaw at full retail price. However, for our viewers, we're able to get 50% off from TackRight. Grab your mini chainsaw, 50% off. Get free shipping if you purchase today. The orders will ship within 1 business day from TackRight's warehouse in New York. Coming right out of New York, right to your house. And all you need to do is go to the website tackrightredacted.com. That's TACRIGHT redacted.com. tackrightredacted.com. Orders will ship within 1 business day. Get 50% off right now. Battery powered with one hand. Perfect little chainsaw to get some work done in your yard. Awesome stuff. Love those guys. Well, does the UK government have a secret role in NATO's terror armies? A bombshell new report in the Grey Zone details newly declassified British files that shed scary light on the origins and the internal workings of what's known as Operation Gladio. Operation Gladio is a covert NATO plot that deployed fascist terror militia armies across Italy. So the big question, is London right now doing the very same thing in Ukraine? Kit Clarenberg is an investigative journalist. He's the man that broke this story for the Grey Zone, and he joins us now. Kit, welcome back to the show.
Hey, how's it going?
Good. Thanks for being here. Before we get into these documents, Kit, I want to go over, and maybe you can explain to our audience and help educate us on exactly what Operation Gladio is. That's Gladio. And how has NATO carried out these terror armies?
Sure. So in the wake of World War II, the CIA and MI6 created this network of secret fascist stay-behind military units across Europe. The name Operation Gladio was the title given to the Italian wing of this. But the purpose was to create what's known as a strategy of tension, in which citizens would sacrifice their freedom for security, justify the existence of NATO and the presence of vast amounts of US troops on European soil. Britain led the charge on this. They effectively helped create NATO because they wanted to keep the Americans in and the Russians out, and that ethos kind of persists to this day. But yes, so I mean, in Italy, this network carried out assassinations, bank robberies, bombings, like the 1980 Bologna train station bombing, which killed hundreds, injured vast amounts of people. This was carried out using explosives provided by MI6, and these militias were trained on British soil, and this operated in total secret for decades. It was only in 1990 that the scandal exploded publicly, and this led to about a year of critical reporting in the mainstream media. It's quite remarkable. I mean, it would never happen today. And then it's just promptly forgotten about, I think, in part because there were 3 parliamentary probes in Switzerland, Italy, and Belgium. The findings were never translated into English. I mean, they were also heavily redacted. So particularly sections related to the US and British involvement in this. So there are, and the media's terrible memory that means that this has been essentially forgotten, but it has enormous implications for understanding all manner of events, phenomenon, and indeed, yes, the conflict in Ukraine today. As the Grey Zone reported in November last year, the senior British British military intelligence officials are involved in constructing a secret partisan terror army to carry out terror attacks in Crimea and other kind of Russian or Russian occupied territory. So yes, I mean this is hard. This strategy is one that is very much in operation today, and it's likely not only in Ukraine but other parts of the world too.
It's amazing that these documents were declassified. So what exactly do these declassified documents reveal about the UK's involvement in Operation Gladio and what is purportedly happening today now in Ukraine?
Yeah, well, so I mean, the files were no doubt heavily weeded before that they were deemed fit for public consumption. I mean, Britain has an intensive culture of state secrecy. Any information they don't want in the public domain, they can one way or another suppress it. So yes, that it's been released at all tends to suggest that there was a heavy cleanup operation. But nonetheless, it's they're full of fascinating nuggets. It's very clear that from the moment the scandal broke, the British were keeping a very close eye on the European media and what was being said publicly by politicians. There's a particularly revealing passage where an Italian politician who admitted that he knew about the existence of Gladio from 1966 onwards, he specifically asked the British for details of their involvement in quote-unquote stay-behind operations in 1964. This was the same year that there was a planned coup involving P2, which is this fascist Masonic lodge, and was heavily connected to Gladio. Now, the fact that he was asking the British about for information on this tends to suggest that the British were involved in plotting to overthrow the government because Italians had, much to London's chagrin, elected a left-wing leader and administration, which the British and the Americans were not going to tolerate. So I mean, in terms of relevance today, it is admitted, and this wasn't revealed publicly for many years subsequently. It is admitted by a senior Italian official that explosives were provided by MI6 and the CIA were used to in a variety of terror attacks. Now, we know that there is an enormous amount of money being spent by London and Washington, kind of off books, like using black ledgers for covert operations in Ukraine, but also it seems in Russia too. There have been a number of terror attacks in mainland Russia since this started. There was an independent journalist last year claimed that this was all being coordinated by the Pentagon's JSOC and the CIA. I think that one of the kind of benefits of flooding a country with secret arms caches is that you never quite know what's going to happen to them. It's stated in the declassified files that several ammunition and explosive dumps that were created by the British and the Americans in Italy, the arsenals went missing. So that's kind of left to the imagination what might happen. But the British and the Americans obviously knew that this was a likely or at least possible eventuality, and they don't seem to have been particularly concerned. Again, it's a way of creating chaos. Strategy of tension. People are frightened to leave their homes, and beg the state to spy on them more intensively. I mean, I think as well that there are all sorts of references which which make clear that the British knew a lot more than they've ever admitted publicly. So, for instance, in 1978, Aldo Moro, who was this kind of centre-left Italian prime minister, he was kidnapped by this militant left-wing organisation known as the Red Brigades, and he was held in captivity for 2 months. And then when it became apparent that the Italian government was not going to negotiate with them or release its operatives from prison in return for Morrow. They killed him and they left his body in a car by a river for the police to find. It seems, yes, like pretty flagrant from the files that Britain knew exactly what had happened, and that there was the aforementioned P2. Its operatives, which included, it was like a who's who of Italian spooks and financiers and industrialists and police officers and top military brass. They were involved in the crisis committee responsible for finding Morrow. Ergo, they deliberately sabotaged their own investigation to ensure that he wouldn't be found, and yes, that he would be killed. There are indications that the Red Brigade was heavily infiltrated by P2, and they were specifically pushing the group to carry out violent acts in order to discredit the left and justify fascism. That's quite remarkable. And yes, there are all sorts of unanswered questions about Morrow's kidnapping today. And lots of speculation and innuendo. I mean, the British seem to have had an inside view of what happened, at the time, which does tend to suggest that they were either involved in its planning or they were, apprised of its dimensions at the time.
So when we talk about Ukraine, you mentioned Crimea, and of course, to maybe dive more deeply into how this is being operated in Ukraine. If I understand it correctly, the idea is you have this sort of stay-behind terror group that acts as if, they're totally separate from the UK. They're totally separate from NATO on the surface. Mm. They're there to foment discontent. They're there to carry out terror attacks. So it looks as if it's being carried out by Russia or it's being carried out by some other nefarious group. And therefore you need us, NATO, to be here to secure your safety, right? Even though we're the ones carrying out the terror attacks, right? That's how this is going. That's basically what this is.
Yeah, absolutely. Richard Sackler, who's a leading academic on Russia, has a great line, which is that NATO exists to protect against security threats its existence creates. Which is quite remarkable. But and that's without even factoring in that that NATO has a history of sponsoring terrorist attacks and massacres in order to justify its effective occupation of Europe. What I find it very interesting that if NATO was truly committed to security, let alone protecting the sovereignty of Ukraine, why they haven't just let Kiev in. Despite the fact that the comedian in charge has repeatedly asked, very publicly, you might think that if they were truly committed to those principles, they would accept them in a heartbeat. That's not going to happen. It's likely not going to happen after the war ends. If that day ever comes at this rate, it's quite remarkable. But yes, one of we see this in. The kind of the annual earnings reports, but on major weapons manufacturers and defense contractors, they openly talk about how tensions in Eastern Europe and indeed in the Pacific are their key profit drivers. Since the war in Ukraine began, the profits and indeed the share price of Raytheon et al. Have skyrocketed. This is fantastic business for them. So why would they want it to stop?
Yeah, absolutely. And of course, they'll continue this. It's a great point you bring up about, well, if you want the security, why isn't Ukraine a part of NATO already? But they'll just use them. They'll just use them as a proving ground for weapons testing from here on out. Kit Clarenberg, thank you so much for this report. You can read the full report. We'll link it up in the description below. It's at thegrayzone.com, which of course continues to be one of the best investigative journalist websites and news organizations in the world. Kit, thank you for your reporting on this.
God bless you. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Kit. And I see people saying, it's funny, as Kit's talking, I see people in the chat, they're like, this guy's too smart. Can you put on subtitles, slow him down a little bit? So there's too much going on in his brain. He's too much of a smart guy. And that ends up being a lot of the truth we have with a lot of our independent media guests, our journalists on here, who are not sort of bought and sold journalists who work at CNN, these other places. These are wicked smart people who spend, like Whitney Webb, right? Spend hours researching, right?
Yeah, these are people that they're not handed a script. There's not like a corporate script that's been handed to them just to read. They actually have to go out and find the information themselves and do journalism and research, and that just makes you smarter.
Right, exactly.
And,
by the way,
and sort through information that's generally hidden from them or tried to be kept from them, so they have to like fight to get the information.
Yeah, and you remember Kit Clarenberg, of course, was also detained at the airport in London when he landed by British police, and held him for 5 hours, questioning him over his reporting. Took his electronics devices, and yeah, this is what's happening right now. Of course, there was outrage across the UK as a result of that, but anyway, great reporting from Kit, and continued support of independent journalists like what the Gray Zone does. So thank you to Kit for joining us. Coming up next, we're going to be talking about this UFO story. Dr. Michael Salla is going to be joining us to dive deep into this because a member of the Canadian Parliament has come forward with an amazing letter that has just been made public. And what he says in this letter, it just confirms it. It confirms it all. A member of the Canadian Parliament says this, and we're going to dive deep into what this means and what this means for disclosure. And I'm going to ask him also about distraction, the idea that it's all a distraction or it's just a psyop when people throw out those phrases. Like, what are they really saying? We're going to have a deep discussion about this. I'm excited to have Dr. Salla back on the show. And yeah, it is the first day of summer. So thank you guys for joining us here on this first day of summer. And I should mention, maybe we can run, I guess we can't run that graphic again, can we? If you're just joining us, we did hit
what graphic do you want?
2 million subscribers.
Oh, yeah,
if you have it handy. Yes. Yeah, so Grim made we just hit 2 million subscribers. So thank you, everyone. Thank you. Yes, 2 million subscribers. It's crazy to think. And yes, Natalie is not here tonight. She is off tonight, but the boys are here. So David's in the booth, Philip's in the booth, Grim is in the booth. So it's the boys' night here on this Wednesday. But yeah, it's crazy. 2 million subscribers. And it happened overnight. Like we woke up and we hit it. That's crazy. It's crazy. I can't wrap my head around it. I really can't.
Yeah, congrats.
Yes, it's amazing. No, what it means to me is it's not about us at all because we're just covering stories that matter to people. It's about we have viewers who are seeking the truth and people who are on this journey with us who are seeking enlightenment away from this paid billionaire media narrative, right? That's been forced down our throats for so many years. You know, when growing up, we had CBS, ABC, and NBC, right? Then you got Fox. That was about it. Then you got the cable channels. But it's all still corporate media. It's all still paid for by corporate media, and it's all of the billionaires that are making so much money on this. So anyway, I just want to say thank you for the support. So thank you guys so much for that. And George Galloway was nice to tweet about it today, and others. Lucas, I think, a number of people were kind enough to do that. So thank you guys so much for your kind tweets today and your support. Just want to say thank you. We've got more news to get to. But first, with banks collapsing and the turbulent state of the stock market, millions of Americans have watched their retirement savings disappear. I want to share with you a unique investment opportunity. It's not only protecting retirement savings, but investors are seeing consistent yields and growth. You got to check these guys out. Phoenix Capital Group is offering high-value U.S. oil and gas investments through their corporate bonds program. Now, it's a way for people to invest in energy assets, which I'm a big fan of, owning commodities. And you can own energy assets and diversify their portfolio. The yield ranges from 8 to 12% APY, paid monthly with different qualifications and maturity dates. So even, you could look at it and say, hey, I want to keep some money in these bonds for 1 year and I want them to grow 8, 12%. Great. Phoenix Capital Group is a tech-led energy company owning in some of the most lucrative basins across America. Investor capital, along with their own capital, goes towards cash flow positive oil and gas projects. They had the choice of offering a significantly lower interest rate and paying the difference to middlemen, but decided to break the mold and bring stronger investments directly to the investors. So these 8 to 12 API corporate bonds are higher than CDs or annuities. They offer more than double the typical yields. So if you're looking for alternative investments with sizable yields and monthly payment options, I highly recommend, like monthly dividends coming right to you, I highly recommend checking out Phoenix Capital Group's bond offerings. To learn more, download their free investor guide today at phxonredacted.com. That's phxonredacted.com. redacted.com and let them know that you heard it from us here on the show. They're big fans of what we do here at Redacted, and we are big fans of oil and gas and the bond program. So again, check it out. PhoenixOnRedacted.com, PHXOnRedacted.com to get their free investor guide today. Well, a bombshell letter or report has just emerged from a Canadian member of Parliament, Larry Maguire. In this letter, Maguire reveals that the Canadians, along with the other Five Eyes alliance, the US, New Zealand, Australia, and the UK, have UFOs or UAPs from other worlds, off-world vehicles, and they are actively reverse engineering these craft and then, of course, covering it up. Dr. Michael Salla is one of the world's leading experts on this subject. He writes at exopolitics.org, and he writes about intergovernmental politics and this exact subject, and he joins us now. Dr. Salla, welcome back to the show. Good to have you here.
Thanks for having me.
So before we get into the details of this letter and what this member of Parliament has said, what is the Five Eyes Alliance for our viewers who might not know what this means?
Well, the Five Eyes Alliance is an alliance of 5 English-speaking countries that were allied with the British in some way, former colonies. So as you mentioned, Britain, you have the US, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand, and they cooperate in a range of intelligence and research projects going all the way back to the Second World War. And today they have been identified as with these UAP study groups, and that their letter by Larry Maguire implicates them in actually having some kind of reverse engineering program that's currently being conducted.
So what is the contents of Larry Maguire's letter here? We'll put it up on the screen. What stands out to you?
Well, there are a few things that stood out there. It was a letter to the National Defence Minister of Canada, and Maguire is a current MP for the Canadian Parliament. And he was concerned that the AUKUS alliance, which is a treaty or an agreement between Australia, the United Kingdom, and the US, which is a defence treaty designed primarily to deal with China in the Pacific, that they are making moves to reveal the existence of some kind of alien reverse engineering program. And for some reason, Canada and New Zealand have been kind of left out of that particular loop. And that with AUKUS making an announcement in the near future, that Canada would look very foolish if it didn't introduce greater transparency regarding UAPs, UFOs, and any kind of reverse engineering studies that they have been involved in. So this letter was released in March of this year, and it said that by May, the Canadian government really should take steps to release some information about what the Canadians have been doing regarding UAPs. So he was really warning the Canadian government that, you know, they really need to be proactive here. Otherwise, they'll be kind of left in the wake as Australia, the UK, and the US take the lead in revealing what's going on concerning UAPs and their reverse engineering.
So you two questions there. Number one, what specifically do you think the AUKUS and the Five Eyes countries are going to release? What do you think that they will say in this announcement? And number two, what has Canada been doing that they feel maybe they should be a part of this conversation and at the table, otherwise they might be left in the lurch? In your research on Canada, what have you heard from whistleblowers? Have you heard from members of the government who've come forward to you on what that reverse engineering program looks like in Canada? So first on the AUKUS question.
Well, as far as AUKUS is concerned, I mean, this is, I think, a kind of cooperation between these 3 countries that kind of share information at the highest level, not only concerning nuclear secrets, because one of the big developments over the last year was this agreement between the UK, Australia, and the US for Australia to acquire some nuclear submarines, Virginia-class submarines, and that these would be built in Australia and that nuclear secrets would be shared. I think that was a kind of way to indicate not just that Australia would be let in as a country or read in as a country to these kind of like highest tier level secrets concerning a UFO or nuclear technologies, but that Australia would actually also be read in at that highest level concerning UAP secrets. Because one of the things about the classified projects is that when it comes to the most secretive classified programs concerning the reverse engineering and the production of these UAP or flying saucer craft, that you have less classified programs acting as a cover for that. That was something Edward Snowden released about a decade ago with those NSA releases. So what we have here is that with this nuclear agreement between Australia, Britain, and the US, that the nuclear secrets is a kind of less classified level. It's an entry level, if you like, to these deeper secrets concerning reverse engineering of classified spacecraft that are being retrieved, presumably from extraterrestrials. So what this letter from Maguire signifies is that you have this, out of the Five Eyes nations, Australia, the UK, and the US are read in at that highest level in terms of what's going on in these reverse engineering programs, whereas Canada and New Zealand are left out because they're not part of the AUKUS agreement. They're not part of the kind of sharing of the nuclear secrets at the highest level.
And then as far as Canada goes, what programs have you heard from, whether it's whistleblowers or members of the government over the years, that Canada has been actively involved in this research and downed craft, et cetera? Of course, famously, we have the Shag Harbor incident a number of years ago, something that that was one of the first real UFO incidents that I became really fascinated on at a younger age for me. But beyond Shag Harbor, what do we know of Canada and sightings and testimony from credible sources?
Well, we know from Canada that there have been a lot of UFO incidents there, and that all the intelligence on those incidents have been shared with the US, and now we know with the Five Eyes partners, and that the US has, with the Canadian government, gone in to explore those incidents, such as Shag Harbor that you mentioned, and that whatever craft were found, they were taken to the United States, particularly to Wright-Patterson Air Force Base, for reverse engineering. And that was the agreement. That was the way it was all set up immediately after the Second World War, that these Five Eyes countries, they would share intelligence on any of these craft that were found, and that the US would take the lead in the study and reverse engineering of those craft. But later on in the 1960s, after the fallout from the Kennedy assassination, with the passage of Freedom of Information Act legislation in the US, these projects began to be kind of shared between the different Five Eyes nations. So you would have like Australia, Canada, Britain, like taking a greater role in kind of like some of the follow-on of the study of these projects. And now we know from this Maguire letter that Australia, Britain, and the US are sharing the reverse engineering data on how to build these technologies. So I think, for example, that the agreement that was reached between Australia, the US, and the UK on those on building nuclear technologies, that was the cover for this particular program, where some of these craft, these reverse engineered craft, whether we're talking flying saucer-shaped craft or flying triangle-shaped craft, that these are now being built in Australia, and Australia is going to be developing an indigenous kind of like space program, secret space program.
Do you believe that, your reporting on this has been amazing, and of course, going back to Admiral Byrd in Antarctica, and of course what happened in Antarctica with the secret space program and the building and reverse engineering of craft from the Germans after World War II. There's a lot of people think that, the end of the Third Reich, and that was the end of it. Aren't fully aware aren't brought up to speed on the fact that the Germans actually, a large portion of the production was moved to Antarctica, as you've reported, and many others have now come forward and reported as well. So this production of reverse engineering of craft, which a lot of it takes place in Antarctica, has a lot of that moved away from there now or towards Australia and other places, or is a lot of it still happening in Antarctica?
Yes, well, what happened in Antarctica is a big key to understanding what has really been this race between all the major nations in terms of finding, studying, reverse engineering, and putting into action whatever kind of craft that they've found around the world. And the Germans did send a significant contingent down to Antarctica, and that they were able to survive the end of the Second World War. They were able to deal with successive attacks by the British military in 1946 and then by the US Navy in 1947. The two successive Antarctic summers after the Second World War. And after those attacks were successfully defeated, where the Germans down there were able to put into operation their reverse engineered flying saucer craft. So they actually built these things in the 1940s and defeated the best aircraft that the Navy had that was sent against them in Antarctica. And so after that, agreements were reached between the Germans and the Americans. That's the background behind Operation Paperclip. And the Germans were a key role in helping reverse engineer these technologies that were being found all over the world and being taken to places like Wright-Patterson Air Force Base for study and to various facilities around the United States. So what's happened is that more and more of the production of these craft has been shifted out of the United States into Five Eyes countries like UK, like Australia. And what Australia offers is a vast continent, which with a very small population. And so you can have very large facilities there built in places like Pine Gap in Australia and other areas in Australia where virtually no one knows what's going on. And it's because it's thousands of miles from the largest metropolitan areas, you can have production of vast fleets of spacecraft. So I think that's what's happening, that Australia has been chosen to host the production of a lot of these reverse engineered spacecraft, and that what's happening in Antarctica, a lot of the facilities down there continue to exist. They continue to be used by various corporations, but more and more of that is being shifted into Australia because now Australia has a lot of advantages over Antarctica, because it's much more accessible. It's in a friendly country where legislation can be passed to prevent kind of external or other third countries from coming in particular China. Whereas in Antarctica, the big problem is China is building bases all over Antarctica. And so the more of these reverse engineering facilities remain hidden in Antarctica, the more likely China is going to be able to build bases on the surface and kind of like find out what's going on down there.
Fascinating. I mean, to me, the Antarctica piece of this is so fascinating, and you write about it extensively in your book on Antarctica. But it's not just you, of course. We know Admiral Byrd, who went down there with a large Navy contingent to, I don't know, to attack the remnants of the Third Reich in 1947. Most Americans have no idea that actually happened. It's all very public. People can look at these documents everywhere, right? And he spoke about this in the Chilean newspaper, his interviews in the Chilean newspapers as well, about what he saw there. This is an admiral talking about what happened there.
Well, that's exactly right. The Chilean newspapers, I mean, that's always been cited extensively as, one of the strongest pieces of evidence that this battle in Antarctica really did happen. There was also documents and testimonies released after the fall of the Soviet Union that there was a battle in Antarctica and that the Soviets learned about this battle, that they actually sided some Navy seamen who reported about these flying saucers coming out of the ocean and just attacking the ships and, of course, the aircraft that was launched by the Philippine Sea and whatever other aircraft carriers were in the vicinity, and those were being destroyed. So those are kind of public records. We also know from former Navy personnel such as William Tompkins, who actually was part of a Navy espionage program out of Naval Air Station San Diego from 1942 up until 1945, that he said that the Navy were receiving briefings from spies that were embedded in top aerospace or aviation companies in Nazi Germany, that the Germans had relocated a lot of their equipment and resources to Antarctica because they knew that the Third Reich was doomed, and so that they were relocating things, and so that the Navy was already cognizant of that during the Second World War, and after the war was over, then they would kind of send people down there to find out. So yeah, there's a lot of records showing that that Antarctica was the host of this German contingent down there. And the one for me that kind of really stands out is that under Operation High Jump, there were 3 task forces. I mean, there were 2 naval task forces and an overland task force, and they converged on Queen Maud Land. So this is of that these naval task forces, there was an east, there was a west, and there was a central task force that went around, that circumnavigated Antarctica and would converge opposite Queen Maud Land, which is exactly where Nazi Germany had established its bases prior to the Second World War.
Fascinating. I just want to get you out of here on this because I see this comment and it kind of rises to the level for me. This is just a personal aside. I just want to say this, Doctor. When someone just wants to shut down conversation about something in modern day parlance today, they'll say, that's racist. And then you can't have a conversation about it. Or someone will say, that's woke from the other side. You can't have a conversation about it. The other big thing that I can't stand is when someone says, this is all a distraction. And then you can't have a conversation about it. And I'll see this on different UFO related videos and interviews. And as it relates to this disclosure and what's actually happening, I see people say, this is all a distraction. Or they'll just throw out the term, this is a psyop, which I've been talking about with you. Is part of this a psychological operation in order for the military industrial complex to make more money, right? Blaming some sort of an alien invasion, but it kind of covers over the real story, which is, yes, we do have these craft, but now they're going to use it and say that it's nefarious when in fact it's not. So that part of it really bothers me, that it's a distraction. When I hear that, it just makes my skin crawl. Or it's a psyop, and then they don't have any other discussion points to have a discussion about it. Well, what do you mean exactly it's a psyop? And what do you mean exactly it's a distraction? Let's have a conversation. Let's be specific. So when someone says that to you, Doctor, this is a distraction, this is a psyop, how do you respond to that?
Well, I'd say there's a big difference between a psyop and a limited hangout. I mean, a psyop is intended to distract people's attention from some other issues that are about to be revealed. And so you want to distract people by putting out some concocted, fabricated information. So there's a lot of people in the truther community that think that the whole UFO narrative that's now unfolding, UAPs, that this is a big psyop. Well, I think they're making a mistake. In fact, it's a limited hangout. What they're doing is that they're trying to get ahead of something that they cannot control. That the UFO issue, the extraterrestrial issue, has been an issue that's been around since the 1940s, successfully covered up with all of these advanced technology built from the retrieved spacecraft from extraterrestrial civilizations, and the extraterrestrials themselves visiting us. You have the remnants of ancient spacecraft that are activating, and that there's kind of a lot of rumors that these are about to reveal themselves publicly. So I think what's happening is that you have the intelligence community and the military communities kind of like trying to catch up, trying to get ahead of a story that they can't break. I mean, those that are sticking to this UAP issue being a distraction, they have a very limited understanding of just the extent of this. I mean, if you go to that Maguire letter, I mean, it says that in 1950, the Canadian government had an interest in this, and it was talking about Wilbert Smith, who was a senior minister in the Canadian Department of Transportation. And he said that he had been talking to top-level officials in the United States, scientists, that said that this flying saucer issue was classified even higher than thermonuclear weapons. So fancy that. That's how important this issue was back in the 1950s. And so today, it continues to be that kind of significance, and all the other issues are subordinate to that. So I think people who think that the UFO issue is a distraction, they really need to read up on the literature and understand that this is really what's happening is a limited hangout.
I think you're right about that. I think anyone who says this is a distraction hasn't read one book on the subject. I'm just going to say that. Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe they've read 30 books on it. If they have read 30 books on it and they still think it's a distraction, I would be shocked. But chances are they haven't read any of the literature on it. They haven't read any of the reports on it. And there's plenty of really great places to start. I mean, even beyond your books, if someone thinks it's a distraction, what's one or two books that you would recommend someone start with to educate themselves on this subject?
Well, when it comes to Antarctica, I definitely recommend my book, Antarctica's Hidden History. When it comes to just understanding the scope of what's going on, Stephen Greer in 2001 released his Disclosure Project book, where there were 60 witnesses, the first-hand eyewitness testimonies of 60 witnesses to the extent of what's going on. So that book was very profound in my kind of like awakening, and I think it continues to be important today.
Yeah, I would agree with you. It's a great book by Stephen Greer as well. Dr. Michael Salla, great to have you here for a great discussion on this. And this is an unbelievable letter from a member of Parliament in the Canadian government. This is really remarkable. Thank you for joining us, and thank you for adding some great context to this story.
Thank you for having me, Clayton.
Thank you so much, Doctor. Really appreciate it. And should point out, of course, that there are people said, I would love to see pictures. There are tens of thousands of pictures. And in fact, you can read in Dr. Salla's books, you can see the photos. In his most recent book, there are excellent photos of these craft from insiders, a person who literally a whistleblower on this, who's explaining and showing you all of these photos. So you can see those easily in the books. By the way, I should mention Dr. Stephen Greer is going to be on the show. I've been talking with him. He's going to be on the show at the end of this week. Very excited about that. So I'll be talking to him about a wide range of topics on this, specifically on disclosure and what this means. Again, it's very interesting. People have their loyalties. You want to get angry. You want to get in a fight with someone, just go on UFO Twitter. It's known. It's like I have a lot of friends that cover this, a lot of journalists in this field. And it's like, I guess, going on Reddit or something. It's like if you just want to get pissed off, you have your hardcore beliefs, and go on UFO Twitter for a little while, and you'll be furious at life. You'll be like, I got to get off this social media stuff. It's crazy. Yeah, I mean, that's why I brought that up about the idea of it's a distraction or you're wrong about this. Okay, well, if it's like what RFK Jr. says. It's like, I don't have all the answers. I'm a journalist. I'm asking questions, right? That's what we do on the show. Show us the evidence. Well, we see the documents, we see the photos, we hear from people who are actual insiders and worked in the government who are blowing the whistle on this. They've seen the evidence. They've had top-level secret clearance that you and I don't get access to. They have. And they've come forward. And others on their deathbed have revealed this information, like Colonel Philip Corso, by the way. So, there's a lot of questions. And I have a lot of questions for RFK Jr. To understand about the UFO question as it relates to his family. And so we're working on having RFK Jr. here on the show. And that's a question I'll ask him specifically. I will ask him those questions about his involvement, his family's involvement with the UFO project, what they knew about that. So I'm not afraid about it. I'm very excited to get to the bottom of these questions, and I think we shouldn't be scared about it either.
And I've always looked at it like, it's like I don't have to believe it for it to be right. So it's like, even if I don't believe something, even if I don't necessarily believe somebody's testimony, that doesn't mean it's wrong. because I don't know. I wasn't there. So,
Right.
it's like I have to take it with like, I've heard it, I don't believe it, but that doesn't mean it's wrong. And that's the jump that people often make that drives me nuts, is they're like, well, I don't believe this, therefore it's wrong. And I was like, no, you just don't believe it.
Right.
But you don't know that it's wrong because you don't know.
Right. You're sort of stubborn or sort of stuck in your own ways about something. And I often say, I think that those are the most dangerous people. You have to watch out for those people who are completely inflexible in the face of facts. And you have 12
flag planters, I call them.
What do they call them?
Flag planters.
Flag planters. Yeah.
Yeah. You plant a flag and you refuse to move it. Like you're there and you're not moving no matter what you hear, see.
Yeah. Yeah. And so I always challenge you, if we're wrong, tell us. It's like RFK Jr. says, if I've got it wrong, then explain to me specifically how, and show me the data that disproves this, rather than just randomly throwing out a sentence about something, it's a distraction, it's a psyop. I loved his response, though, on the psyop question. It's a limited hangout. And that's probably the smartest thing I've heard in a while. It's very, very, very good. Hey, well, we've got more news to get to here on this Wednesday. We're going to talk about cow farts. That's right. With a actual rancher who knows all about cow farts. And are they crushing us? Are they killing us? Is that why we need to stop eating meat? Because of flatulence from cows? Is that the reason? No, it's not the reason.
As much meat as I eat, you would think if that were a problem, that I would have that much flatulence, and I don't. I have less eating meat than eating other things. So.
But it's not you, it's the cows.
I know, but I'm eating the cow.
It's the grass.
I think that their flatulence would carry over to me.
Go eat grass and then see if you get flatulence. We'll see.
Instead of eating that steak tonight, go out in your backyard and just eat a whole bunch of grass and see what happens.
All right. I mean, okay.
I got to be honest with you.
I'm eating the grass they've eaten.
When I worked at Fox News, there was a woman that worked in the tape department who was vegetarian, and it was in an enclosed environment. It was like it was underground, this particular room, and it was like all glass enclosed where you would go to get tapes. If you needed a tape for a segment or some archived footage of something, you would have to go down to the archive, and it was like walking into a toxic cloud every time. It was really awful. Like you would just you'd go down and be like, "Hi, Monica, can I have tape number 561, please? By the way, can you start eating some meat in your diet? Because, oh my God, all that lettuce you're eating." Anyway, so Natali is off tonight, but she did file this report. She sat down with a rancher from Wyoming who's been on the front lines in this debate, and it's a really fascinating discussion about global warming, about farming, cattle ranching, from an actual person who does it every day on a ranch in Wyoming. And she is wicked smart about this, and I can't wait for you to watch it.
Well, are cow farts really destroying the earth, or is that an environmental talking point that doesn't really bear out? I wanted to talk to someone who actually works in the industry, so we invited Casey Atkinson. She's a cattle rancher, and she makes it her mission to educate people about what she does, what other animal farmers do, and how she sort of takes the brunt of a lot of environmentalist messages. So Casey, thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you so much for having me.
Now, can you describe a little bit about your work and where you are in the country?
Yeah, so I'm in Southeast Wyoming. We live on a very isolated, high elevation ranch that is literally 10 miles past nowhere. It's 85 miles to the nearest town, which would be where I went to high school. It's over 40 miles to the nearest paved road. And so our house sits right about 7,500 feet in the air, and we go a little bit lower on some spots and certainly much higher in others on our ranch. And so it's very mountainous, very arid, very rocky, kind of a harsh, hostile place to live, but that's what makes it perfect for running cattle.
Okay, so I've heard you mention that one of the things your generation of farmers deals with that previous generations of farmers did not is social activism, or having to sort of justify yourselves for social movements. So can you expand on that?
Yeah, so I think, we are all kind of worldwide, right? Conversations around climate and the environment are certainly a hot topic of conversation. And so one of the things that, we certainly have to do now is to try to explain the other side of the narrative, and provide a complete picture of how, just one, you can't take just a single aspect of cattle production, which are the methane emissions, and pull that out without understanding the implications to a full ecosystem or understanding the whole role that cattle play in that ecosystem and maintaining rangelands and mitigating drought and reducing wildfire danger, along with, most importantly, providing an incredibly important food source for people across the world. And so, being engaged in that conversation, being very transparent about what we do so that people become comfortable and familiar with what we are doing. We know that at least in the United States, people are multiple generations removed away from the farmer ranch. And so they don't really have anyone in this industry anymore that they can ask those questions to. And so it's kind of our responsibility to step up and put ourselves out there so that people hopefully can find us and connect with us and have those conversations.
It seems like people take it so viscerally, like absolutely eating meat is destroying the planet. And that is, if you say anything about that, against that, it's just, you're dead to me. But can you talk about this cycle of ruminant animals and methane emissions and the cycle of things, some things that I've seen you do on your Instagram? Maybe you can tell our audience too.
Absolutely. So it's important to understand, cattle are not the only ruminant animals that exist. Things like moose, deer, elk, even giraffes are ruminant animals, and they play a critical role in the ecosystem, and they've existed, right, for centuries, for thousands upon thousands of years. Ruminants have been a part of our ecosystem for good reason, because they are the only animals that are capable of eating and digesting grasses and forages that have a high, what we call cellulose content, because that's something that you and I or other monogastric stomached animals could not ever break down and utilize. And so the thing about plants, right, they're our number one fighter for reducing carbon in the atmosphere. But in order for plants to do their job properly and to really thrive and maximize the amount of carbon dioxide they're going to pull out of the air, they need someone to graze them, right? They need someone to come along and to help them thrive and grow through proper grazing management. And so that's what ruminants do. They're the only ones that can. And so there's this cycle, we refer to it as the biogenic carbon cycle, whereby ruminants come in, they graze those plants, that causes those plants to kick into growth mode. It helps them propagate and replicate and spread out across the surface of the ground. By doing that, there's more plants to pull more carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere. And so, of course, we know through the process of photosynthesis that plants will then release oxygen back into the air, which you and I need to be able to breathe. And then they send the carbon component down through their roots into the soil where it can be stored and it can't do any harm. And so again, it's just this continuous cycle that has existed probably as long as plants and animals have existed. And so the methane that cattle are releasing when they're digesting that cellulose that's in those plants is what's causing the methane to occur. They're belching it out into the atmosphere. It's this whole cycle. It's this constant recycling of essentially the same product. Methane will break down in 9 to 12 years in the atmosphere, where the plants can then have access to it again. And so the methane emissions that cattle or any ruminant animals are getting, it's not anything new, right? It has existed as long as plants and animals have existed. And so in order to maintain the cycle, you have to maintain ruminants on the land. Cattle, by nature of grazing, we're helping reduce wildfire danger. We know here in the West, wildfire is a major problem. We're helping to mitigate against drought, because the more plants you have, the more carbon that is stored in the soil, the more water that soil can retain, which helps mitigate against drought, which is incredibly important. We know that soil erosion is a way for that carbon to escape and to release. Anytime the soil erodes or it cracks or it fissures, that carbon that those plants have worked so hard to put back underneath the ground where it can't do any damage can escape. So through proper grazing management and my cattle walking across the surface of the earth, they're keeping that soil compacted and keeping it from cracking and keeping it from eroding so that we can trap the carbon where we want it to be. In fact, there was a study done by the University of Florida that found between 10 and 30% of the world's carbon storage actually is located underneath the feet of U.S. cattle.
Oh, wow. And so where do humans come in then? Do we have to eat the cattle in order to keep this cycle going? I guess would, a counter argument be, well, then we should leave them to do it. How would you respond to that?
I mean, the reality is cattle are domestic animals, right? They need a caretaker. They need someone to take care of them. And so in order for me to be able to afford to do that, they have to have a way to generate money, right? Cattle really only exist because they are a nutritious, healthy food source that is one day going to provide beef to people. If they didn't do that, then I wouldn't be in business and I wouldn't have the capability of running them. And because cattle are domestic compared to something like a giraffe or an elk, right, I can control how they graze to make sure that I'm doing that properly, to make sure that I'm maximizing the impact that they can have. Whereas, wild animals are just going to do willy-nilly whatever they want. They may graze something and they may not. And so I think cattle play a vital role nutritionally. We know that, the protein that comes from animals and the protein that comes from plants, they're very different. Animal protein provides some amino acids which are essential to us as human beings and our health and well-being that simply don't exist in plant proteins. We know that there are things like vitamin B12 that exist in animal source proteins that don't exist at all in plant proteins. And so, the way that we are created and the way that our body breaks down and metabolizes protein and is able to access those nutrients comes much easier to us from animal source proteins than it does plant source proteins. And so, they are a vital role in our food supply, and that's why we are raising them. We can kind of pull double duty. We're able to take care of our land properly because of utilizing them. They're able to take food sources that are inaccessible to you and I on land that would have no other purpose. You can't grow crops where I live, right? I have a 28-day growing season at 7,500 feet in the air. I spend about 10 months of the year in winter. So I'm not growing anything else here. This land would be unusable to humans, essentially, if I wasn't running cattle. But because I'm able to use them and take care of my land, then I'm also able to provide an incredibly nutritional food source to you, which is essential to your well-being.
Now, I wonder, because a lot of people who are farmers, some of the data seems to show that plant-based products contribute to deforestation because you have to grow more to produce something that's based on seed oils, like a meatless burger. Now, during the pandemic, those meatless burgers were kind of all the rage during lockdown. And now there's evidence that shows that Wall Street bets on those non-meat burgers have not panned out, and those companies are really hurting for market share. So what do you think of these sort of seed oil-based meatless products? And is it true that they seem to require more farmland? And do you think that people are understanding that? So I asked you about 8 questions all at once. Maybe you can just respond to what you think of the meatless industry and how that relates to farming.
So I'm certainly not an expert on, how much land they require. What I do know that we saw in the United States was the meatless options were the last things left in the meat case. During the pandemic, everybody was eating the real products. Every food source has an environmental footprint, period, right? Yes. There's an environmental impact to everything that we eat, whether it's plant or whether it's animal. What I do know is here in the United States, we are losing hundreds of acres of some of our best quality crop ground every single day as urban expansion occurs. They're building housing developments, they're putting up schools and parking lots and, shopping structures. And that's land we will never get back in production. Land is a finite resource. And so, we can't make more of it. So where's all of this additional food going to come from? Because to even come close to replacing the nutrition that we would need to replace by eliminating animal source proteins, how would we ever begin to grow enough additional crops without the land being available to do that. And I think that's something that I constantly ask that no one has an answer for, because the reality is I don't think that you can. We simply do not have the land available. And if we're talking about climate, the only three things that can impact our climate in a positive way are forests, plants, essentially grasslands and rangelands, and the ocean.
Yeah.
And so, if you're going to cut down a forest, you're going to contribute to climate problems. If you are not keeping your rangelands and grasslands healthy through proper grazing management, you are going to contribute to climate problems. And, the ocean is what the ocean is. But I think, these are pieces of the conversation that people aren't having honestly, and certainly aren't being had by, I don't think, politicians and the people who are making these decisions without considering the consequences of them.
Yes. Okay. So I didn't realize that. I guess, during the pandemic, it seemed like a lot of articles were about like the popularity and sexiness of these seed oil based meatless products. So it's interesting you say that a lot of them were sort of left in the supermarket, and I didn't notice because I don't want to eat those because seed oils are inflammatory. So I don't feed that to my family. Now, I heard you address also the meat industry's trade with China, and I thought it was fascinating, something you've said about how Americans eat so much ground beef, which kind of made me giggle, and how you have to do overseas trade in order to run your business. Can you explain that?
Yeah, so, if I'm producing a product, right, one animal is producing everything from super high quality ribeyes and T-bones and, fillets and all of those delicious steaks, and then all the way down to ground beef. Well, if you walk into the grocery store, one is selling for $20 a pound and one is selling for $6 a pound. And so if we look at how Americans eat, on a given year, usually the minimum is 60%, but on some years it can even reach as high as 80% of what they consume is in ground beef, which is one of the least expensive products that we sell. And so if I look at how, value is determined in my animals, I need to maximize that value to stay in business, because inflation is not only hitting our customer, it's hitting us as well. Everything that I have to buy to be able to properly take care of my animals is costing me more. So I need to be able to get as many dollars for that animal as I can. And if we were to go into raising ground beef, one, we wouldn't need our feed yard system anymore, which is one of the major drivers to allowing us to have a green or an environmental footprint of we're only contributing 2% to America's greenhouse gas emissions. Just a mere 2% is all my cattle are producing. Well, if I take them out of the feed yard because I don't need such a high fat content on them because I'm no longer producing steak, right? They have to live longer out on grass. And as I've already said, eating the grass and digesting that cellulose is what's creating the methane emissions. So our environmental footprint would go up, which we certainly don't want, because our cattle cannot produce the lean ground beef that people want. And so, we just don't have enough older cattle in our system that, we're culling out of our herds or whatever to meet that demand with our young cattle who are producing high quality beef. And so for me, I need to look at the countries that are going to eat that high quality product I'm producing, which are typically the Asian countries, Korea, Taiwan, Hong Kong, Singapore, places like that really love our product. And they are places that eat a lot of steak. And so for me to maintain the value of my animal, I need to have those trade relationships. I need to be sending the product that Americans aren't going to consume to those places so that I can maintain the value of my animal and stay in business. I know here on the ranch, we raise mama cows, which means we're step one of essentially 4 in producing beef. But every time I sell a calf off of my ranch to go on to step 2, about $100 of their value is derived from their future export value.
Wow.
And so if those exports went away, immediately my animals just to me become about $100 less valuable. And that would be a significant loss across the number that we sell, right? That's thousands and thousands of dollars that we would immediately lose. And that would be the difference between us staying in business or having to sell out.
That's so interesting, right? Because you don't think about the fact that American ranchers make such delicious steak, and so much of it leaves our shores. I found that fascinating, and I didn't know. Let's see. What else did I want to ask you about? Oh, you mentioned that you don't set the price of your cattle, so you don't even know what your profit will be at the end of the year. Do the export? First of all, why is that the case? And the meat that you export, are you able to set a higher price for at least that?
So the beef chain, the way that the beef product, it's incredibly complex and complicated. Cattle live for approximately 2 years before they go to harvest if they're part of the, traditional beef chain. And they're going to have, in typical 3-4 owners before they become beef. Because we're all just kind of segmented. That doesn't mean that there aren't people who aren't doing the whole chain or doing a couple stages in the chain, but like we're literally just focused on step 1, which is producing calves. And so because I'm kind of the bottom of the chain, I'm literally just selling on an open market, essentially. We sell on a video auction. And so it's whatever someone is willing to pay me for my cattle on the day that I choose to go to that auction and sell them. And so I don't have any control over that. Think about like going to maybe an estate auction for people who aren't in agriculture, right? If the auctioneer puts something up for bid, it's whatever the people determine that value is for that item that day. That's the scenario kind of that I'm in. But typically, as we have looked back historically, the cattle market has kind of been cyclical on a 10-year cycle. And so typically 3 of those years you're going to lose money. 3 of those years you will make money, and 4 of those years you will break even. And so the goal for me as, the manager is I have to take the 3 years I'm making money and put that away and use that responsibly. So on the 3 years I lose money, right, I'm still breaking even across a 10-year span every single year. That's kind of my goal. Can I break even this year? Because if I can break even, I can stay in business. And so it's just the way that it is. I don't know that we will ever see a better solution. We obviously see some people who are getting into direct to customer sales. And so they are taking animals and they're raising them clear through the process and then selling that meat directly. They then can set the price, based on their costs, and hopefully make some money. But we are just, like I said, I'm 85 miles from the nearest town. We don't really have a federally inspected plant anywhere near us, which is something I would have to send my animals through in order for it to be legal to sell that to a customer. I don't have access to the feed resources to feed them out. I know a lot about cattle and nutrition and different things, but understanding how to properly feed out cattle nutritionally so that you're meeting all of their needs and creating that expected high quality product, that's not something that I want to do because I don't have the time, quite frankly, to be able to do that. There's just so many little pieces. And so for us, what works best is we're just going to raise calves. We're going to raise them till about 6 months of age. And then we're going to send them on to the next person who is specialized in their part of the chain. And let that beef move through and know that someday my beef is going to end up in a grocery store, most likely here in the United States. Most of the beef that we raise is still sold here in the United States. Just because exports are important to us doesn't mean that, the majority of the beef that we produce doesn't still end up here and that people can't walk into the grocery store and find American beef, because that's what you're going to find primarily in the grocery store here is American beef. And so, we only import, it's right under 10% of the beef that we import in the form primarily of lean trim to make that ground beef that people are going to eat. So 90% of what people consume in this country is still beef that people like me are producing.
Yeah. I remember my husband once in a Walmart was like, look, some of this is from China. What's that about? And then when I heard you explain it, I thought, oh, well, that doesn't sound like much of a problem. It's just, there's a lot of anti-China sentiment. When you see that on your food, you're like, what's this about? But it seems like a actually fairly reasonable trade association that happens.
I mean, overwhelmingly, the beef that we bring in is going to come from Australia, New Zealand, Canada, and Mexico. I would even venture a really large percentage of that 10% we are importing is coming from those 4 places. And then, obviously we have very specific parameters that other countries are supposed to meet and adhere to be eligible to bring beef in from other places. And so actually, I think, I can't remember exactly how many are on the list, but there's, less than 25 approved countries, I think, to bring beef in from. So we're hopefully, for the safety of our people, because we take safety really important as American producers, and we expect the same with our trading partners. And so, but we also know China, right, is a huge opportunity for us trade-wise, because China has a lot of people who probably want to eat high-quality beef. And while other countries are, developing systems similar to ours, we are still the largest. Who are producing the largest quantities of that high quality beef. And so if we could get our product into China, then certainly that's an export market that could be very valuable to us.
Yeah. Well, that's one of the reasons I'm so glad to talk to you, is because I feel like this maybe anti-farming movement, either from environmentalist perspective or from urban planning perspective, or, some of what you see in Europe is, just seizing lands of farmers because of the nitrogen content of the industry. I feel like these things become acceptable because we're so disconnected with the food system. But if we have a better understanding of it, maybe the rest of us will think this is not right, or this is something that needs to be protected, or this is not something that I can lob onto when, say, the mainstream media tells me that it's all the animals' fault. So I want to thank you for sharing that with us. And where can we follow you so that we can continue to see and be connected to your work?
So I primarily share on Instagram. And so my social media handle is 10 miles past nowhere. And it is the number 10 for the 10. So 10 miles past nowhere on Instagram. I would love to have people follow along. If they have any questions, they can send me a message. I try to be very diligent about getting back to everyone. I can share, scientific research, if that's what people are interested in, that proves that cattle are a really critical component of our ecosystem, and that, just removing them without considering all of the consequences is certainly going to have kind of a catastrophic effect on those ecosystems that people aren't thinking through and they're not being honest about.
Yeah, well, I agree with you, and I'm really glad to have come across your research and your profile. So thank you again for your time today.
Thank you so much, Natalie. I appreciated being on.
Well, thanks so much for that interview. Really interesting. And it's really interesting to hear the perspective of an actual rancher who's doing this every day and who is around these animals on a regular basis, and to hear what lies are being perpetrated on our behalf, thanks to the mainstream media and the World Economic Forum and every other manner of trying to get rid of meat from our diet and trying to tell us that that's the way to solve global warming right now. Never mind the fact that, of course, we saw this past week all the data on actually the Earth has been cooling for the past 20 years. But that's all a distraction. Don't worry about any of that actual science. So I just want to say thank you to all of you again, once again, because we hit that 2 million subscriber mark early this morning. So again, thank you from the bottom of my heart. 2 million subscribers on YouTube. And of course, moving towards that 350,000 mark on Rumble. So thank you guys so much. So that puts us up close to 3 million already, which is really amazing for all of you out there seeking the truth and being a part of our great community here. We don't have all the answers, but we seek the truth together on this journey. And you can become a member of our VIP community, which is our Redacted Rebels VIP community. And for the price of a cup of coffee once a month, you can support independent journalism if you'd like. Again, it's very cheap. All you need to do is go to redacted.inc, not .com, it's .inc. And then on the right side of your screen there, you click on the community tab, and you can become a part of our community, get access to exclusive videos and content, live streams that we're doing here on the channel just for community members. And it's also just a way to support what we do. We're not paid for by BlackRock. We're not paid for by Pfizer. We're supported by you. So thank you guys so much for becoming a member a Redacted Rebel VIP member. Thank you guys so much. And we will be back here tomorrow at 4 p.m. Eastern Time. So thank you once again for subscribing, and we'll see you tomorrow, everyone. Have a great night.